Cook County family courthouse smelled like old wood and old decisions, like the building had been collecting heartbreak for 100 years. That afternoon, it felt personal. Fluorescent lights buzzed over the marble hallway, turning every face a little gray. My arms ached from Daisy's carrier, and from the way I'd been holding myself together for months with nothing but stubbornness and caffeine. Daisy was 3 months old. She slept with her mouth slightly open, lashes resting on her cheeks, completely unaware that her life was about to be relabeled and filed away. I kept rocking the carrier without thinking, a tiny sway that had become muscle memory at 2 in the morning, at 4, at whenever she decided hunger was an emergency. I caught my reflection in the polished stone as I passed a column. A woman I barely recognized stared back. Hollow eyes, hair twisted into a quick knot. A clearance rack dress I'd bought because it was black and plain enough to look respectful, even though it hung loose on my body like it belonged to someone else. I told myself I was here for dignity. My hands shook anyway. The hallway felt like judgment. Couples sat too far apart. Folders clutched like shields. A clerk's voice echoed somewhere, and every name sounded like a sentence. I could feel my own story broadcasting from the diaper bag on my shoulder and the dark circles under my eyes. 3 months ago, I'd still been a wife. A week before that, I'd still been the kind of girl who thought love meant staying. Then I found the messages on Grant's phone, the ones he forgot to delete because he never imagined I'd stop believing him. I remembered the taste of metal in my mouth, the way my body went cold before my mind caught up. 3 days later, I saw a tiny plus sign and let myself feel happy for 5 stupid minutes. I pictured him coming home, apologizing, choosing us. Then the papers arrived. Divorce paperwork handed to me in a hospital room while I was still sore and bleeding and learning how to keep a baby alive. Room 304. Family court. The numbers sat on a plaque beside a heavy oak door. My vision kept blurring, and I blamed the lighting. Daisy made a small sound, the kind that meant she was climbing toward wakefulness, and my chest tightened because I knew what came next. Her eyelids fluttered, and I felt that familiar countdown start in my bones. If she woke fully, she would want to eat right away, loudly, on without caring that strangers were deciding our future. My breasts ached at the thought, milk ready like my body was trying to protect her from everything. I bounced the carrier once, twice, praying for a few more minutes before the storm. Through the little window in the door, I could see Grant already seated at the table. His suit fit him perfectly, the kind of fit you get when you've never had to choose between dry cleaning and groceries. Beside him sat a lawyer in a navy jacket that probably cost more than my rent. Grant's hair was styled the way it always was when he wanted to look harmless and successful. And next to him was Sloane Carver. She didn't sit so much as she arranged herself, leaning into Grant like she belonged there. Even from behind glass, I could see the shine of her hair, the careful makeup, the easy confidence of a woman who had never stood in line at a discount store praying her card wouldn't decline. Her dress looked expensive in the quiet way money likes to be. My throat went tight. Not because she was prettier, not because I wanted him back. It was because he brought her here, to my divorce, like a victory lap, like I was already erased. My fingers hovered over the handle. I should have pushed it down right then. I should have walked in and ended it. But the truth was, I'd already done my stalling in the parking lot. I'd sat in my car for 20 minutes, forehead on the steering wheel, watching other people walk into the building like it was just another errand. I counted my breaths. I checked Daisy's blanket twice. I whispered to myself that I could do hard things. Now there was nowhere left to hide. I straightened my shoulders, even though they felt like wet paper. I adjusted the strap of the diaper bag. I swallowed the ache in my throat and pushed the door open. The room had been laughing. I heard it the second before I stepped inside, a bright little burst that didn't belong in family court. Then I crossed the threshold, and the laughter died so fast it felt like someone pulled the air out of the room. Grant's head snapped up. His smile collapsed. His eyes dropped past my face, past my hands, straight to the carrier. And in that stunned silence, I understood something simple and terrifying. He hadn't been expecting Daisy. I set Daisy's carrier on the floor beside my chair and felt my arms keep trembling after the weight left them. She blinked up at the ceiling lights, confused, then turned her face toward me, searching. I lifted her out, pressed her warm cheek against my collarbone, and rocked the way I always did when my nerves threatened to snap. Across the table, Grant Parker sat perfectly still, like someone had paused him mid-breath, his gaze fixed on Daisy as if she were a word he could not pronounce. Sloane Carver leaned close to him, a polished hand resting on his arm, and even her silence felt expensive. The judge shuffled papers with the patient rhythm of someone who had watched love turn into paperwork 1,000 times, and I could hear the click of her pen like a metronome keeping time with my heartbeat. I tried to focus on the formal words floating in the room, but my mind kept running inventory the way it always did now. Diapers in the bag, one spare onesie, bottle of water, and the sickening number in my checking account that never stopped shrinking. I had been working night shifts at a diner on the South Side, sleeping in pieces, waking every 2 hours to feed Daisy, and telling myself that being tired was temporary. The rent was 2 months behind. My car made a sound that promised a repair I could not afford, and pride was the only thing I still owned outright. Daisy began to fuss, a small warning whimper, and I adjusted her against my shoulder, breathing in that clean baby smell that made me both softer and fiercer. I could have apologized for bringing her, but I refused to act like motherhood was an inconvenience I needed permission for. Grant's lawyer looked at Daisy like she was a disruptive exhibit, but Grant did not look away at all. His face had lost its shine, in the one he wore in our wedding photos, the one he wore in public when he wanted people to believe he was a good man. I watched his throat move as he swallowed, and something inside me lifted its head. Not hope, but anger that had been sleeping under exhaustion. I had not come here to beg. I had not come here to be rescued, or shamed, or judged for being the one left holding a baby while my husband sat beside his new life. I came to end it clean, with no strings, because I was done letting Grant decide what I deserved. The judge asked questions in that steady, procedural way, and I answered with the same calm voice I used with rude customers at the diner. Inside, my thoughts were loud. I kept seeing the night I found the messages, the bright screen in the dark bedroom, Grant's name in her phone like a joke at my expense. And I remembered standing in the bathroom 3 days later, staring at the test, and then laughing once because the timing felt like the universe had a cruel sense of humor. For 5 minutes, I let myself imagine Grant coming home, touching my belly, saying he would fix everything. And for 5 minutes I was 16 again and still believed apologies could rebuild trust. Then the hospital nurse handed me the envelope, and the paper inside had his signature on it, neat and final, like I was a task he wanted off his list. Now, in this courtroom, I shifted Daisy higher and let the truth land where it belonged. Daisy was 3 months old, born on February 14th, and her blood tied her to the man across from me whether he liked it or not. I did not need to accuse him. Daisy's face was doing it for me. Grant's eyes flicked to Sloane, and then back to Daisy, and I saw fear there for the first time, sharp as a cut. My own voice stayed steady in my head as I decided what I would not ask for. No alimony, no child support, no property, no shared accounts, no last-minute bargains, no dirty hope that he would suddenly remember how to be decent. I told myself we would be fine, even though fine was a story I repeated so I could keep walking. In reality, I had $300 left after bills, and I was already rehearsing which groceries could stretch the farthest. Daisy's fussing rose again, hungry and impatient, and I bounced her gently, refusing to let my rage spill onto her soft skin. The air in the room thickened, the judge watching. Sloane, too, still. Grant trapped in the consequence he thought he could avoid. I was ready to sign and leave, ready to walk out with my baby, and my pride, and nothing else. That was when the door exploded open behind me. Not with courtroom impatience, but with urgency that carried authority. 3 men in dark suits stepped in, moving like they had practiced entering dangerous rooms, and every instinct I had went cold. This was no longer a divorce hearing. The courtroom door slammed open so hard the latch rattled. 3 men in dark suits moved in without hesitation, the kind of movement you only see in people trained to enter danger. Their eyes swept the room, exits first, then faces, then hands. My body tightened around Daisy before my mind caught up, and I shifted her higher on my shoulder like my bones could shield her. The judge's pen hovered above the paperwork, frozen mid-stroke. Grant's lawyer stopped breathing. Even the air felt rearranged, as if these men brought their own rules inside and I knew my divorce ended. One of them stepped forward, older than the rest, shoulders squared, hair cut close, expression unreadable. I learned his name later, Frank Rivas. But in that moment, he was simply the person everyone instinctively made space for. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The urgency sat in the way he angled his body toward Grant, blocking the doorway as if cutting off escape routes. The judge's face stayed neutral, yet her eyes flicked to the bailiff and back, calculating how small her power was. I felt my cheeks burn, realizing the courthouse belonged to someone else today. Grant's skin went pale under his tan, like fear was draining him from the inside. His hands clamped the table edge until his knuckles blanched, and his gaze kept darting between Frank and Daisy, never quite meeting mine. Sloane's posture stiffened beside him, her perfect composure slipping in tiny fractures. The glossy confidence on her face turned into a mask that didn't fit. I could see her realizing, too, that this room was no longer about marriage certificates and custody schedules. Something bigger had arrived, and it was looking straight at the man she chose. The betrayal suddenly had teeth. Frank's mouth moved in short, clipped phrases aimed at Grant, but I heard only fragments. Warehouses, fire, shipment, message. The words didn't belong in family court. They sounded like headlines, like police scanners, like the stuff you ignore until it's on your street. Grant tried to respond, but his throat worked without producing anything convincing, and I watched the judge's shoulders tighten. She didn't interrupt, didn't call security, didn't assert authority. She simply waited, as if the safest choice was to let the storm pass through her courtroom unhindered. My stomach dropped, and I understood why Grant lied about his job. Then the room changed again, not with speed, but with gravity. Another man entered behind Frank, and it was as if everyone's spine remembered how to bow. Dominic Moretti didn't look flashy. He looked inevitable. Black suit, clean lines, calm eyes that took inventory the way Frank's had, only slower, like he had all the time in the world. He paused at the threshold, and nobody spoke. Not the judge, not Grant's lawyer, not Sloane. I felt the silence thicken around him, and in that silence I knew this was the real hearing. The rest of us were just paperwork, and Dom's attention went to Grant first, and I didn't need to hear the details to read the accusation. Grant's import and export story, the late-night calls, the business trips that never had receipts, all of it rearranged itself into a different picture. I remembered the way he guarded his phone like a second heartbeat. I remembered how he flinched whenever I asked about invoices or payroll. Dom's controlled anger made it clear that Grant hadn't just cheated on me. He'd stolen from the wrong people, and he'd talked to the Kingsley crew like betrayal was a side hustle. Now we all paid. Cold understanding slid into place. If Dom and the Kingsley crew were circling each other, they would look for pressure points, and Grant had handed them one with his own name. My name was still attached to his in court files, in hospital records, on Daisy's birth certificate. That was what collateral meant. Not money, not property, but people. I didn't have to be guilty to be useful. All I had to be was reachable. I tightened my hold on Daisy and felt her tiny fingers curl into my dress, trusting me completely, as if I could outmuscle a war. Dom's gaze shifted and landed on Daisy with precision that made my skin prickle. He didn't smile or soften. He studied her the way a strategist studies a map, noticing the innocent point that changes every route. For a heartbeat, I saw restraint cross his face, like a baby forced him to choose between efficiency and the code he lived by. Grant's mess had spilled onto my daughter's blanket. I was no longer just an ex-wife walking away. I was a target being measured. When Dom looked back at me, I knew the step would decide whether we left alive. The courtroom went still around Dominic Moretti, like the building itself had learned to hold its breath. The judge's pen hovered above the divorce papers, and for the first time since I'd walked in, she looked less like an authority and more like a woman measuring risk. Frank Rivas stood near the door with two other men, shoulders squared, eyes scanning. Grant's lawyer sat rigid, hands folded like prayer, and I held Daisy tighter, feeling her warm weight anchor me in a room that had turned unreal. In my head, I kept shouting the same defense. I am divorcing Grant. I came here to cut ties. I want nothing. No alimony, no child support, no share of whatever lies he built. But Dom looked past the paperwork and straight at the only thing that mattered in his world, connections. He made me understand it without needing comfort. The Kingsley crew did not care about innocence. They cared about leverage. Grant had stolen from Dom and handed information to the Kingsleys, and now they wanted a price that would hurt Grant and make Dom look weak for allowing it. My legal status did not protect me. Enemies did not study court filings. They studied blood and labels. Wife, child. If the Kingsleys saw me leave this courthouse with Grant's baby, they could follow me to my apartment, grab me when I was alone, and use Daisy and me like a hostage note written in skin. Even if Grant claimed he did not care, hurting us would still send a message to Dom. That was the part that made my stomach drop. I was not just collateral to Grant. I was collateral to Dom. Daisy stirred and fussed against my collarbone, the small, impatient sound that meant hunger was coming. My body responded before my mind did, milk letting down with a sting. I had been counting ounces and hours for 3 months, cutting corners at the grocery store, stretching tips from night shifts, telling myself we were fine. The truth was uglier. My rent was behind. My account balance lived in the low hundreds, and I had no room left for one more emergency. Now the emergency had a name and a crew. Dom turned his calm toward Grant, and the air seemed to harden. Grant's face drained as if someone unplugged him. Dom treated betrayal like math. Grant owed $3 million, the stolen amount plus penalty, and Dom made it clear repayment would come in money, years of work, or blood if Grant tried to run. I watched Grant fold inward, watched Sloane clutch his arm like she could hold him together, and I felt a sharp, bitter relief that consequences had finally found him. Then Dom's focus returned to me. He drew a line between guilty and innocent with the same certainty he used on Grant. The guilty would pay. The innocent would be protected. But protection was not kindness. It was a system with rules. Dom laid out the terms like he was sliding a contract across the table. I would live in one of his properties. I would follow security protocols. I would not leave without guards. I would not make calls or post anything without approval. I would be invisible until he said the threat had ended. With the Kingsleys, ended could mean months. It could mean years. A cage, my mind whispered. A beautiful one, but still a cage. I pictured gates and cameras. I pictured men with weapons outside a nursery door. And I pictured Daisy learning to crawl under watchful eyes. My pride flared. but it felt thin next to the fear sitting in my chest. I needed to know what Dom wanted in return besides obedience. He did not pretend this was charity. Protecting me and Daisy would help him too. It would show his allies and enemies that he punished betrayal and shielded innocent blood, that he stayed in control even when someone tried to embarrass him. My safety was also his message, his proof of power. I hated that I understood the bargain. I hated that part of me felt relief anyway. Daisy's fussing sharpened, and I realized time was not on my side. Pride would not keep my daughter alive. I swallowed the bitterness and chose the only option that ended with Daisy breathing in my arms tomorrow. I accepted Dom's protection. Not because I trusted him, but because every other path ended with Daisy's face on a missing poster and my heart in pieces again. The moment I did, everything turned into logistics. Frank stepped closer, already thinking in routes and minutes. Dom's people would take me to my apartment immediately. I would have 1 hour to get there and 15 minutes to pack essentials, documents, baby supplies, a few clothes, anything irreplaceable. Everything else would be handled, or left behind. I looked once at Grant and felt nothing but tired finality. Then I adjusted Daisy on my shoulder and followed the suits toward the door, knowing my old life was about to be reduced to what I could carry. Frank moved us through the courthouse hallway like the building belonged to him. I kept Daisy against my shoulder, her breath warm on my neck, while people stepped aside without knowing why. Outside, a black sedan waited at the curb, plain enough to disappear in traffic, but the glass looked thick, almost too dark to be legal. The rear door opened before I reached it. I slid in and felt the air change, quieter, sealed. My heart kept trying to sprint, but my body followed orders, because fear had turned me practical. I watched myself, tried to copy that steadiness. Eli Brooks sat in the front passenger seat, young enough to still have softness in his face, but the shape of a holster printed under his jacket. He twisted around, checked Daisy's blanket, then pointed out the baby seat already installed beside me. A bottle warmer glowed in the console, and a small cooler sat on the floor with formula, wipes, and diapers. Someone had guessed my baby's size, my needs, my panic, before I even agreed. That was the most frightening part. Competence can feel like kindness until you remember it is control. Frank drove steady, like time obeyed. Daisy started to root against my collar, and my breasts answered with an ache that made me wince. In the dim back seat, I fumbled for the bottle I kept for emergencies. Eli warmed it, tested it on his wrist, and handed it back with a careful gentleness that surprised me. Daisy latched, furious for 2 seconds, then quieted into the soft gulping rhythm that always melted my spine. The city slid past the tinted window like a movie I was no longer part of. I realized they weren't kidnapping me. They were evacuating me. Either way, life had changed. My neighborhood looked smaller from inside that car, like it had shrunk from neglect. Frank parked half a block away, in watching mirrors, watching corners, like every parked van was a question. The building was the same tired brick walk-up with a buzzing intercom that worked only when it felt like it. Paint peeled around the numbers. The stairwell smelled like laundry soap and old cigarette smoke. Eli stayed a step behind me, hand near his jacket, eyes moving. Frank stayed outside. I was given 15 minutes, not more, to pack what mattered. My stomach tightened because I owned little anyway. Inside 3B, the mess greeted me like a confession. Dishes towered in the sink. Laundry spilled over the couch. A thrift store changing table sagged under half-used wipes. Daisy's bassinet sat in the corner, the thin mattress covered with a blanket I'd washed until it turned soft as worn cotton. On the wall hung one framed photo from our wedding. Grant's smile bright enough to fool me again. Eli opened a suitcase and set it on the floor. I moved on instinct. Documents first, then baby things, than anything irreplaceable. My hand shook, but I refused to waste time on grief. I grabbed Daisy's birth certificate, my ID, the little folder of medical papers I kept for her checkups. I stuffed diapers, 2 sleepers, and the rabbit rattle my neighbor had bought at a yard sale. In my jewelry dish sat Grandma June's ring, plain gold worn thin, the only thing of value I trusted. Her voice floated up from childhood, telling me survival was dignity with dirty hands. I reached for the wedding photo, stared at it one last time, then set it face down on the counter. I would not carry a lie into the next chapter. Not again. Eli carried the suitcase while I carried Daisy. In the hallway, Mrs. Patel's door cracked open, the way it always did when she heard me struggling past with groceries and a baby. Her eyes slid from my face to Eli's shoulder, where the outline of a weapon showed under his jacket. Understanding tightened her mouth. I wanted to explain, but only a thin cover story formed in my mind. A family emergency, out of town for a while. My throat burned with guilt. Mrs. Patel nodded once, then closed her door and threw the locks. Metal slid, final and fearful. Downstairs, the street looked ordinary, which felt like an insult. Frank opened the sedan door, and the interior swallowed me and my baby like a pocket. The moment I buckled Daisy into the seat, the locks clicked, heavy and certain. My building disappeared behind tinted glass. I thought of the half-washed dishes, the unpaid bills, the neighbors who would wonder, and the version of me who believed I could fix a marriage by being patient. The engine purred. We rolled away from the curb, and Chicago slid into motion without us. I understood I was leaving more than an address. The farther we drove from downtown Chicago, the quieter the world became. Sirens faded into distant hum, and the streets widened as if they had room to breathe. I watched the skyline shrink through tinted glass, Daisy asleep in her seat, and wondered how a life could vanish so quickly. Frank Rivas turned onto a private road lined with bare trees and fresh snow. A tall stone wall appeared, then another, with cameras tucked under every ledge. We stopped at a black gate that opened without sound. No guard booth, just unseen eyes deciding we were allowed inside today, together. The driveway curved through manicured grass and winter gardens, past a small building that looked like a security station disguised as a guest house. The main residence rose ahead, 3 stories of stone and glass, lit warmly from within. It was not a home, it was a statement at last. Before I could unbuckle Daisy, the front door opened and a woman stepped out, mid-50s, hair pinned neatly, eyes kind but sharp. Mrs. Helen Alvarez introduced herself with the calm of someone who has run households and raised children. My arms shook as I handed Daisy over carefully anyway. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something expensive I could not name. Marble floors reflected the chandelier light like water. A painting the size of my old bedroom hung above a fireplace. I felt too loud in my clearance dress, even when I moved quietly here alone. Helen guided us up a wide staircase, past hallways lined with art and closed doors. Frank and Eli stayed behind us, present but silent. We reached an east wing that felt separate from the rest of the house, insulated from noise, designed for privacy. My footsteps disappeared into thick carpet. The suite looked like a hotel room built for royalty, a bed covered in crisp white layers, windows facing gardens, and a bathroom with a tub deeper than my old kitchen sink. I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt suspicious, because comfort offered by strangers came with a bill. Then Helen opened the nursery door and my throat closed. A crib weighted with soft sheets. Shelves held diapers, wipes, creams, and stacks of tiny clothes arranged by size. A rocking chair sat beside a lamp with a dimmer switch. On the dresser sat a breast pump I had seen. My first thought was that it was a mistake, that they had prepared for some other baby, some other woman. Helen's calm confession shattered that illusion. She told me Mr. Moretti ordered this room prepared that morning, before I agreed, to a 3-month-old's needs. He assumed I would choose survival. Dom appeared in the doorway, calm enough to make my pulse race. His gaze moved from Daisy to me like an audit. He explained the rules in simple terms. I could move around the estate, but I could not leave it without guards and his approval. It landed as lock. He added limits that sounded modern compared to the old-world menace of him. No unapproved calls, no social media, and no internet activity that could be traced. My phone would be monitored, my contacts controlled, and I was to become a ghost until he decided it was safe to exist again. In my head, I argued with his words, trying to rename what was happening. Prisoner sounded too honest, protected sounded too polite. The truth sat in the middle, gleaming. I looked at the nursery stocked like a dream and understood why people stay in gilded cages. Soft bars are bars. Dom did not pretend this was mercy. He framed it as balance, punish the guilty, protect the innocent. He also admitted what I sensed, that keeping me under his roof made him look unshakable. An abandoned wife and child in his care warned rivals that he commanded order in chaos. I thought about my apartment, my empty fridge, my overdue rent, and the meals I skipped so Daisy would not. I thought about the Kingsleys watching the courthouse steps, and pride could not stop a bullet or a kidnapping. Only distance and force could. So I nodded, stomach twisting for her. Helen returned Daisy to my arms, and I felt my body unclench at her familiar weight. Dom's presence lingered in the doorway. Then he was gone, pulled back into whatever war Grant started. Helen offered food and rest with insistence, and I let her because my daughter needed me functioning. Later, when the house settled into a hush, I rocked Daisy in the new chair until her eyelids drooped. I laid her in the crib and watched her chest rise in silence. My fingers traced the rail, and I felt chains in the softness. I wondered who I was becoming. Downstairs, footsteps echoed, reminding me this fortress was also a machine. Soon I would be asked to play my part, to be seen at the right moment, dressed correctly, calm enough. Daisy slept, unaware of reputations. I sat beside her crib and braced for the dinner Dom would host tomorrow. Helen knocked lightly after Daisy's afternoon nap, her expression careful. She let me know Dom was hosting associates that night and that he wanted me present. Not invited, not optional. Present, like an item placed on a table so everyone could see what it meant. My stomach tightened because I understood the shape of the message. The abandoned wife and baby were under his roof now, and that was supposed to say something about him, not about me. After Helen left, I opened the closet she had been stocking since we arrived. Practical clothes hung in neat rows, and beside them a few dresses waited in garment bags, soft fabrics that didn't cling to my postpartum belly. Shoes sat in my exact size. A small box held simple earrings and a thin bracelet. I stared and felt uneasy gratitude like I was being cared for and curated at once. In the mirror, I still saw the tired woman from the courthouse, only smoothed at the edges. Helen returned with a stylist she trusted, and I let them work because control was already gone. They pinned my hair back and brushed color onto my cheeks until I looked rested. The dress I chose was deep blue and modest, the kind of thing a woman might wear to a wedding or a funeral. Tonight, it would be both. I thought about my body making a whole person then being abandoned. I told myself to stand tall. Daisy deserved a mother who could be seen without apologizing. Leaving Daisy was the hardest part. Helen promised she would stay with her in the nursery, doors locked, guards positioned, every routine followed. I kissed Daisy's forehead until she squirmed, then handed her over and felt my arms go empty in a way that made me dizzy. I walked down the hallway with my hands folded together, trying not to imagine the Kingsley crew somehow slipping through the walls. Eli waited near the stairs, eyes alert, posture relaxed only on the surface. Frank's presence was farther back, the quiet weight of someone monitoring the whole house. The dining room looked built for power. A long table stretched under warm chandelier light, set with crystal and heavy silver. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters, voices low, switching between polite English and quick Italian phrases I didn't understand. The conversation sounded casual, but the words felt coded, like business meant territory, like shipments meant control. When Dom entered, the room shifted toward him without anyone touching him. When I followed at his side, every head turned, and the chatter thinned into silence. I felt the attention on my skin, curious, calculating, amused. I kept my face calm and my breathing steady, like I was walking through a room full of wolves with a newborn hidden behind my ribs. Dom guided me to the chair at his right hand. The gesture was simple, but it landed like a claim. I sat because refusing would be loud, and loud felt dangerous. Across the table, a man with silver hair watched me with cold interest while another wore a scar near his jaw. I listened as talk circled around problems and agreements, and I realized they were measuring Dom and me in the same breath. One of them hinted that sheltering Grant's wife and child could look like weakness. And Dom answered with calm certainty, making it clear that protecting innocent blood was the point, punishing betrayal was the rule, and anyone who tested him through me or Daisy would learn what protection cost. The room accepted it in silence. I tried to eat when plates arrived, but my mouth stayed dry. Every glance at me felt like a finger on glass, testing for cracks. Dom kept his posture relaxed, yet his presence held the room in place. I remembered Daisy upstairs with Helen, asleep in a crib that wasn't mine, and the thought made my chest ache. In that moment, I understood I wasn't being introduced. I was being displayed. For a brief second, I believed the performance might hold. Then my restricted phone vibrated in my clutch. I shouldn't have checked it, but dread makes you reach for certainty. The screen showed a grainy photo. My apartment building, my doorway marked police tape sagging across the entrance. Beneath it was a message from the Kingsley crew written like a greeting and meant like a blade. They knew where I lived. They were looking. My fingers went numb and the phone slipped onto the table, clattering against a plate. Dom's hand covered it before it could fall. His eyes flicked over the screen, and his expression hardened into decision. The warmth in the room felt fake. He rose, and the chairs around the table seemed smaller. I stood when he pulled me up, my mind stuck on that photo like a trapdoor under my feet. As Dom guided me out, I realized the Kingsleys weren't somewhere out there. They were close enough to send proof, close enough to watch, and my role as Dom's symbol had just become a target. Dom's hand closed around my elbow and guided me out of the dining room before my knees gave out. The chandelier light fell away behind us, replaced by a dim corridor that smelled faintly of wood polish and winter air. My heart kept hammering as if it could outrun the message on my phone. I could still feel the eyes of the men at the table on my back, like I had been dragged off stage mid-performance. He pulled me into a small study and shut the door. The silence hit first, then the nausea. My fingers tingled, then went cold, and I had to press my palm to my chest just to remind myself to breathe. Somewhere upstairs, Daisy was sleeping, safe for the moment, and that thought was the only thing keeping me upright. I kept seeing the grainy photo of my apartment door, tape fluttering like a flag. Dom stayed steady in front of me, not touching more than necessary, but close enough that the panic had something solid to lean against. In his calm, I could hear the truth underneath the threat. He had expected them to look. He had expected them to dig through the places my life had been small and predictable. The apartment was a risk the second I walked into court with Daisy. He had treated that risk like a schedule, not a surprise. Frank had already moved fast, Dom explained in the clipped way he shared information, as if every extra sentence was a liability. My building had been watched, the people around me had been mapped. Mrs. Patel, my neighbor with the soft voice and too many locks, was no longer there. Dom had sent someone to get her to family days earlier, before the Kingsleys could use her as a breadcrumb. I felt relief and guilt crash together, and heavy as stones. Then anger broke through the fear, sharp enough to make my hands stop shaking. He had known the search would come, and he had let me live in that nursery, eat those meals, sleep those deep sleeps, without telling me they were hunting my past. I hated how managed I felt. I hated that my life was becoming a folder in someone else's plan. My voice in my own head rose, demanding autonomy like it was oxygen. Dom did not soften, but he did not mock me either. He carried authority the way other people carried coats, easily, always. In his world, he believed I did not get to know everything, because knowing everything made people sloppy, panicked, reckless. Ignorance, he insisted, could be a shield. It could be the difference between a mother who eats and sleeps and makes milk, and a mother who falls apart before the enemy even arrives. Grandma June would have hated that sentence. I heard her in my mind the way I heard her when I was a kid and scraped my knees, telling me no one got to own me unless I handed them the deed. She used to say dignity was a habit, not a prize, and you practiced it even when you were broke. Standing in Dom's study, I felt that old stubbornness flare, pushing against the invisible walls around me. But I also could not deny what had happened in the last week. I had slept. Real sleep. I had eaten food that did not come from a diner's leftovers. I had held Daisy without counting seconds until the next crisis. If Dom had told me every detail, every watcher, every threat, my nerves would have stayed on fire. My milk would have dried up from stress. Daisy would have felt it in my arms. I hated that he was right about that. I wiped my palms on my dress and forced my breathing to slow. The house was quiet beyond the study door, the dinner continuing somewhere without me, the men returning to their coded talk. I thought of Helen upstairs, humming softly as she checked Daisy's crib, and I clung to that image. Dom's protection felt like a lock, but it was a lock between my child and the Kingsley crew. I stood straighter, even while my stomach still rolled. A sharp knock cut through the room. Frank's voice came through the wood, urgent in a way that erased my brief calm. Grant Parker was at the gates, not arrested, not hiding, but standing there demanding to see his wife and his daughter, as if he still had the right to say those words. My blood turned to ice. I did not want him near Daisy, not after everything, but my past had just found the front door of my cage. Somewhere behind the walls, my baby slept, and my body chose war over shaking again. Frank's message hit like a slap. Grant Parker was at the gates, demanding to see me and Daisy. My first thought wasn't anger. It was the same animal fear I'd felt in court, because Grant showing up meant the Kingsley crew could be watching, learning my new address. I didn't move until I confirmed Daisy was nowhere near the front of the house. Helen Alvarez met me in the hall with Daisy tucked against her shoulder, drowsy, safe. I asked with my eyes, and Helen understood. She carried Daisy back toward the nursery, locks and routine and quiet, and only then did my lungs start working again. I went downstairs anyway. Part of me wanted to hide, to let Frank handle it like everything else. But another part was sick of being a passenger in my own story. If Grant was going to crash into my life again, I wanted to look at the wreckage with open eyes. Through the glass, I could see the long drive and the inner gate under security lights. Frank stood by the controls, Eli behind him. Dom Moretti waited a few steps away, not steering me, just watching my choice unfold. Grant waited outside the inner gate between two guards. His suit was rumpled, collar crooked, stubble dark on his jaw. The shine he wore with Sloane Carver was gone, replaced by frantic disbelief. When he saw me, he lunged forward, but the guards stopped him with quiet professionalism. Hands firm, space controlled. Seeing him like that didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel tired. This was the man who left me 7 months pregnant. Odd then let hospital staff hand me divorce papers while I was still shaking from labor. He'd smiled through the courthouse like I was an inconvenience. Like Daisy was a mistake he could delete. Now he stared at me as if I could save him. He tried to spill explanations, the same tone he used when he came home late and expected forgiveness because he sounded sincere. I didn't need every word. I knew the pattern. For us, a plan, a panic, a promise that never required my consent. Every version ended with me cleaning up the mess. My anger rose, then settled into ice. Love isn't a speech. Love is showing up. Love is staying when it costs you comfort. Grant chose himself over responsibility, over truth, over me, over Daisy. For months I'd waited for him to become the man I married. Instead, I became a single mom, counting tips, stretching formula, telling myself we would be fine because I had no other choice. He was missing from every hard moment, and now he wanted to appear inside a fortress someone else built around us. His eyes kept flicking past me to the cameras, the guards, Dom's shadow. That told me everything. He wasn't here for fatherhood. He was here because fear finally found him, and he wanted to grab innocence like a shield. Me, Daisy, a way to bargain. Something in me snapped cleanly. I did not soften. I did not negotiate. In my mind, I told him he could not touch Daisy, could not rewrite abandonment into concern, could not call himself a father after choosing disappearance. I turned slightly and felt Dom behind me, steady as a wall. He wasn't forcing me to speak. He wasn't ordering Frank to drag Grant away before I saw him. He was letting me decide how this ended. That small gift of agency made my throat burn. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't facing Grant alone. Frank gave a subtle signal. The guards guided Grant backward. He struggled, desperation breaking through his pride, but the distance held. The gate stayed closed. His voice faded with his footsteps down the drive, and I felt the last piece of obligation fall away. The doors shut. My knees went watery. Nausea rolled through me, sharp and sudden, like my body had been holding everything up until the threat left. Dom's hand touched my back, light, grounding, and he guided me upstairs to the rooftop terrace. Cold air hit my face and made me breathe. Below us, the estate lay dark and guarded. Beyond the walls, the city glittered, indifferent. I admitted to myself that I still felt trapped, and that safety came with rules and permission. Dom's calm didn't argue. In his world, protection and control were welded together. And then the realization came, quieter than fear. I felt safer with Dom than I ever felt with Grant. Not because Dom was gentle, but because he was honest, and because his actions matched his promises. That comfort should have been a relief. Instead, it terrified me. Trust meant attachment. Attachment meant something to lose. I felt his world tightening, and my heart tightening too. Dom's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon like he could already see the next move coming. The Kingsley crew was still out there, tightening the world around us. And I hated how much I cared what happened to the man standing beside me. 3 months after the courthouse, my body learned what 8 hours of sleep felt like. Daisy was 6 months old now, sitting upright in the nursery rug, wobbling like a tiny drunk gymnast and laughing at her own hands. She had learned to clap, to squeal, to look for me the second her name was said. I had learned to breathe without flinching at every sound, but only halfway. Even on quiet mornings, my shoulders stayed slightly raised, as if the next disaster might crawl under the door. The estate ran on routines. Helen warmed bottles, Frank rotated guards, Eli checked locks the way other people checked weather apps. I could walk the gardens with Daisy in a stroller, but a shadow always followed, polite and armed. Some days I told myself it was freedom with training wheels. Other days, it felt like a leash made of velvet. On a Tuesday just after lunch, Helen knocked with a face that made my stomach fall. Dom needed me in his office. I carried Daisy down the hall, her fingers clutching my shirt, and the house felt too quiet, like it was holding back a secret. Dom stood behind his desk with his phone in his hand and his jaw set hard. When he looked at us, the warmth I had started to trust vanished, replaced by something sharp and strategic. The Kingsley crew had moved. Overnight, 3 of Dom's warehouses were hit, and 2 of his men did not come home. The message was simple enough even for someone like me. Give them Claire Parker and the baby, and they would stop. I heard those words inside my skull and my knees threatened to fold. I had believed the gates and cameras made us untouchable. I had believed Dom's promise meant safety was permanent. Now the world tilted back into the same ugly truth the courthouse taught me, and that innocence does not negotiate. Dom crossed the room in 2 steps and anchored his hands on my shoulders, forcing my eyes up. His control did not soften the fury in him. He made it clear, without drama, that he would never hand us over. If the Kingsleys wanted war, he would give them war, and he would end it. The certainty in his face scared me almost as much as the threat, because it meant he had already decided what he was willing to destroy. He opened a folder thick with notes. While I was learning Daisy's nap schedule, he had been building a cage around the enemy instead of around me. He met with other families, traded favors, and collected debts like chess pieces. Grant's betrayal became leverage. Dom's people squeezed him until every secret route and dirty contact surfaced. Tonight, Dom was walking into a meeting with Kingsley's leadership and the city's other brokers. He would bring proof and allies the Kingsleys could not ignore. If negotiation failed, he had plans, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who never planned to lose. Then he spoke about contingencies, and I felt my throat tighten. Frank and Eli would move Daisy and me into the safe room under the house. It was reinforced, stocked, and hidden behind a panel in the wine cellar. It had its own air system, its own locks, its own quiet. When I asked how long it had existed, the answer landed like another twist of the knife. Dom had ordered it built the day after I arrived. He had never believed our danger would stay outside the walls. I hated the idea of hiding underground again, like prey. I hated that my daughter's life depended on secret doors and armed men. But Daisy rested her cheek on my shoulder, warm and trusting, and my choice was the same as it had been at the courthouse. Pride was not worth her heartbeat. I nodded and let Frank take the lead, and I watched Eli check my diaper bag as carefully as if it were a bomb, because to them, it was. At the door, Dom stopped me. His hand brushed my hair back, a gesture so human it cracked something in my chest. For a second, his eyes looked tired, not ruthless. He leaned in and kissed me once, firm and brief, like a seal on a promise. It was not romance. It was the way you touch someone when you might not return, when you need them to remember you chose them. I realized I did not just fear him anymore. I feared losing him, and that fear felt like stepping onto a ledge. Frank opened the hidden panel, and cool air breathed out. I descended with Daisy against my chest, listening to locks click behind us. Above, the house looked peaceful, while beyond the gates, men planned to trade my life like a token. Dom's footsteps turned away toward the fight he had been preparing for since the courthouse. In the safe room's dim light, I held Daisy close and waited for the first sound that would tell me if his promise was enough. The safe room felt like a small apartment buried under the house. 2 narrow beds, a tiny bathroom, shelves of canned food, diapers, and spare batteries lined the walls. Daisy's portable crib sat beside a lamp that glowed a dull red, gentle enough for sleep but bright enough to show fear. The air was cool and filtered, smelling faintly of metal and detergent. Frank Rivas checked the heavy door twice, then stationed himself by the panel that led back to the wine cellar. Eli Brooks moved quietly, radio in hand, trying for calm. I paced with Daisy on my hip, whispering lullabies into her hair as if sound could seal us in. Hours passed in a strange mix of boredom and panic. Daisy giggled at my fingers, then fussed, then fell asleep against my shoulder, trusting the world I could not control. I kept imagining Dom somewhere above us, walking into a room full of enemies with my name on their lips. Frank and Eli rotated watch in silence, checking the same corners, listening to the same ceiling as if they could hear danger forming. I tried to drink water, tried to eat a cracker, but my stomach rejected everything. My phone had no signal down here, and the quiet pressed on my ears until I could hear my own pulse. Just after midnight, the lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Frank's head snapped up. Eli lifted the radio and frowned at the hiss of static. A dull thud rolled through the walls, not loud enough to be a gunshot, but deep enough to vibrate the floor. Daisy woke and made a questioning sound. I bounced her gently, forcing a smile she could not read, while my mind raced through every warning Dom had ever given me. Then another thud came, closer, followed by raised voices blurred by concrete. Frank moved fast, the calm in him turning into pure function. He guided me toward a smaller room at the back, barely wider than a closet, with a cot and a second steel door. Eli handed him a keycard, then checked his weapon without looking at me. Frank pushed me inside with Daisy and slid the deadbolt home. He signaled with eyes and gestures that I was not to open for anyone except him or Dom, no matter what I heard. The sound above us changed from thuds to sharp cracks and heavy footsteps. Daisy started crying in earnest, startled by my tension. I rocked her, whispered against her ear, offered the bottle, anything. She pushed it away and screamed louder, a raw baby sound that filled the tiny space. I pressed my lips to her temple and fought tears, because crying felt like surrender. The doorknob rattled. Something scraped metal outside. I put my hand over Daisy's mouth for a second, just enough to muffle the sound, and hated myself instantly. Her eyes widened, startled, then she fought me, tiny fists beating my wrist. I loosened my hand and held her tight instead, rocking harder, begging her with my body to be quiet. Survival makes mothers do impossible things. A voice came through the door, smooth and patient, speaking as if we were neighbors in a hallway instead of prey in a box. It promised that if I opened up, Daisy would be safe, that no one wanted to hurt a baby, that we could all walk out calmly. I listened and felt my skin crawl, because monsters never announce themselves as monsters. They sound reasonable. They sound like compromise. Daisy hiccuped between cries, exhausted, and I could not even soothe her with milk now. Another voice muttered urgency, and I heard something being placed against the door, followed by a quick electronic beep. My mind pictured hinges blowing, hands grabbing, Daisy taken from my arms. I backed into the corner and wrapped my body around hers, ready to be a wall. The explosion never came. Instead, a new rhythm of footsteps hit the floor outside, fast but disciplined, followed by short bursts of sound that made the other voices cut off mid-breath. The air seemed to tilt as the fight moved away from my door. I held Daisy so tight she whined, and I kept listening for Frank's boots, for Eli's quick inhale, for anything familiar. Then I heard Dom, not by name, but by presence, the way the house seemed to obey him even through concrete. The lock turned, the door swung open. Dom filled the frame, face streaked with sweat and dark specks I refused to identify, eyes wild until they found Daisy. His hands checked my arms, my shoulders, her tiny limbs, fast and gentle at once, like he could not trust his own relief. He moved us out past broken glass and smoke. I saw furniture, wine, and shapes on the floor I refused to name. Frank and Eli were hurt but standing. Dom told me the Kingsley leader was gone and the threat was broken. Upstairs, he quietly locked us in his bedroom, and I understood he came back like we were his future. Morning after the breach, the house smelled of smoke and lemon cleaner, and my hands would not stop shaking. Daisy slept in a borrowed crib beside Dom's bed, thumb in her mouth, as if terror was just another dream she could outrun. Dom stood at the window, shirt sleeves rolled, expression flat from exhaustion. I realized the contract had saved us, but it had also swallowed me. If I stayed, I needed terms, not mercy, and my own voice mattered. I told him in the plainest way I could that Daisy came first, always. I would not be paraded, threatened, or managed like luggage. I could accept guards and rules, but I needed respect, and I needed time to rebuild who I was after Grant's ruin. Dom listened without interrupting, jaw tight, eyes steady. Then he nodded once, the smallest surrender from a man used to obedience. He agreed to partnership, not ownership, and something in me unclenched at last. Months passed with a cautious kind of peace. The Kingsley name faded from whispered briefings, and the guards loosened into background shadows. I learned the estate's rhythms, Helen's morning tea, Eli's quiet jokes, Frank's constant scanning. Daisy learned to crawl, then to wobble on her feet, laughing whenever Dom crouched to catch her. Dom kept his word and kept his distance when I asked, letting me choose closeness on my terms. When divorce hearing arrived, I felt ready to breathe. This courthouse was newer, and it didn't smell like broken promises. Still, my stomach twisted as I walked in, because my first trip had changed everything. A clerk handed me forms, and I signed with a hand that barely shook. Grant did not appear. His signature was already there, delivered through lawyers and fear. The judge stamped the order, quick and bored, and that sound echoed in me like a door closing. I was no longer Claire Parker on paper. The clerk asked what name I wanted restored, and I felt a strange grief for the girl who once believed marriage was armor. My maiden name, Dawson, sat in my mouth like fresh air. When I wrote Claire Dawson on the line, my hand steadied. It looked right. It looked like permission. I walked out with the packet held to my chest, and for the first time in a year, the future felt like something I could touch without bleeding. Dom waited outside the courtroom doors with Daisy in a toddler coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She was almost 1 now, wobbling on new legs, gripping Dom's finger like it belonged to her. He crouched as she laughed, patient, steady, letting her set the pace. Watching them, I felt a quiet shock, because this was the proof that mattered. Not guards, not money, presence. He looked up at me, asking without words as if my choice mattered too. He took Daisy into his arms and walked beside me down the hallway, away from strangers, away from court noise. Then he stopped, reached into his coat, and held out a small box, simple and unshowy. He made it clear, with a seriousness that steadied me, that he was not offering escape. He was offering a life I could accept or refuse. No fear, no obligation. Just him, me, and the child he had protected with everything he had left. I stared at the ring inside and felt the old panic rise, the memory of signing papers in a hospital bed, the ache of being trapped. But Daisy reached for Dom's tie and giggled, and the sound cut through my fear like sunlight. I realized my yes would not erase danger, but it could define my terms. I accepted, trembling, because choosing him was not surrendering. It was deciding that safety and love could coexist, if I demanded both always. Later, I thought about the first courthouse and the second one, about how one smelled like endings and the other felt like beginnings. A cage can be built from iron, but it can also be built from lies, exhaustion, and fear. Dom's walls had protected me, yet my choice was what set me free. Survival gave me time. Boundaries gave me dignity. Love, when it showed up in actions, gave me a future. Sometimes soil grows the strongest roots still. If you're listening and you've ever felt cornered by someone else's choices, I hope you hear this. You can survive without losing yourself. You can say no, set terms, and rebuild from whatever tried to break you. My story started with betrayal in a courthouse hallway and ended with my daughter laughing between two hands that held her steady. If this hit home, leave a comment. Like and share if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone.